There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, and only in retrospect do you see them for what they were. The turning of a page, the shifting of a tectonic plate in the landscape of your soul. For me, that moment was the specific way the blue light of a muted television screen caught the line of Julian's jaw. He was asleep, or pretending to be, his head a familiar, comforting weight in my lap. This had become our ritual, a strange and unspoken sacrament in the months since his world had come undone. But tonight, the air in my small apartment was different. It was thick with the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of unsaid things, each one a particle of dust dancing in the low light, waiting to be seen. I had learned to navigate the currents of this new reality with the caution of a sailor in uncharted waters, my heart a compass spinning wildly, searching for a true north that seemed to change with his every breath. I knew the precise geography of his sleeping form, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the subtle twitch of his fingers against the worn denim of my jeans, the soft, rhythmic exhalation that was both a comfort and a torment. I had spent months cataloging these details, filing them away in the archives of my mind like priceless negatives I could never develop. To develop them would be to expose them to the light, and the light, I feared, would burn them to nothing. Our friendship was the most stable structure in my life, a carefully built thing of shared history and easy laughter. What was happening now, in the quiet theater of my living room, felt like a tremor threatening its very foundation. I was the keeper of the quiet, the guardian of the unspoken agreement that this, his head in my lap, his body curled against mine on the too small sofa, was about his comfort, not my longing. It was a role I had accepted because the alternative was a silence I couldn't bear, the silence of his absence. So I sat, night after night, a living statue, my own needs calcified into stillness, my pulse a frantic drumbeat only I could hear. I would watch the films we put on, their plots and characters a meaningless blur, my entire consciousness narrowed to the point of contact, the warmth of him seeping through the fabric of my clothes. It was a sweet and agonizing form of torture, a slow drip of poison that also felt like the only thing keeping me alive. But on this particular night, the pretense felt thin, worn down to a translucent fragility. He stirred, not with the groggy disorientation of someone waking from a deep sleep, but with a slow, deliberate grace. His head shifted, and his eyes opened. They found mine in the gloom. And that was it. That was the moment. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, no thunderclap or sudden swell of orchestral music. It was just a look. But in it, the vast, unspoken territory between us was suddenly illuminated. It was a look of such profound, unguarded vulnerability that it stripped away every layer of plausible deniability we had so carefully constructed. The narrative of just friends, of he just needs a place to crash, of he's just grieving, it all evaporated in the intensity of that gaze. In his eyes, I saw not the shadow of his recent heartbreak, but a reflection of my own aching loneliness. I saw a question, one he seemed too terrified to ask aloud, and it was a question I had been screaming in the silent confines of my own heart for years. The air crackled. The ordinary Tuesday night was over. Something new had begun, and its first breath was the terrified, hopeful beat of my own heart. The tectonic plate had shifted, and I was standing on the fault line, waiting for the world to either collapse or settle into a new, unrecognizable shape. To understand the weight of that look, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship. Julian and I were, by any external measure, an unlikely pair. We met in college, two celestial bodies orbiting in entirely different galaxies. He was the captain of the swim team, a minor campus celebrity forged in chlorine and early morning practices. His was a world of kinetic energy, of loud, back-slapping camaraderie, and the bright, clean lines of athletic achievement. He moved through the world with an unthinking confidence that I, in my quiet corner, found both intimidating and deeply fascinating. I was a photography student, most comfortable behind a lens, a silent observer by nature and by trade. My world was one of shadow and light, of composition and stillness, of capturing moments rather than living in their chaotic center. I was assigned to cover the swim team for the university newspaper, a task I initially dreaded. I imagined myself an awkward interloper in their world of raw, physical power. I spent weeks at the edge of the pool, the humid air clinging to my skin, the acrid smell of chlorine a constant presence. I watched them, a pack of sleek, powerful animals, cutting through the water with brutal efficiency. And I watched him, Julian. There was a different quality to his movement. Where others were pure force, he was force and grace combined. He had a focus that was palpable, a stillness in his eyes before he launched himself from the starting block that felt almost meditative. I found myself trying to capture that, the moment of quiet intention before the explosion of motion. My photos began to reflect this obsession. Less action shots, more portraits of exhaustion, of concentration, of the vulnerability that came after a grueling race when the mask of the athlete slipped. I took a picture of him one afternoon, sitting on the tiled edge of the pool, head bowed, water streaming from his hair, his powerful shoulders slumped in what looked like utter depletion. The light from the high windows caught the droplets on his skin, making them look like tiny diamonds. In that moment, he wasn't the celebrated team captain. He was just a young man, tired and carrying a weight I couldn't see. That was the photograph the paper ran on the front of the sports section. A few days later, he found me in the campus coffee shop where I practically lived, a folded copy of the paper in his hand. I braced myself for a complaint, an accusation of making him look weak. My camera, which was usually a shield, felt like a useless weight on the table between us. He didn't look angry, though. He looked curious. He slid into the chair opposite me, the scent of coffee and old books suddenly mixing with the faint, clean smell of soap that always seemed to cling to him. "This is your photo?" he asked, pointing to the image of himself. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the newsprint. "It's good," he said finally, his voice softer than I'd expected. "Everyone else always takes pictures of the finish. The celebration. You took a picture of the work." He looked up at me then, really looked at me for the first time. "It's more honest." And that was the beginning. That was the seed. Our friendship grew in the spaces between our two worlds. He would find me in the darkroom, the red safe light casting him in demonic hues, and ask me to explain the alchemy of turning light and silver into a memory. I would sit with him in the library while he wrestled with complex lines of code for his computer science degree, a language as foreign to me as ancient Greek, and I'd feel a strange sense of peace just being in the quiet hum of his concentration. We discovered a shared love for bad sci-fi movies and a mutual disdain for crowded parties. He drew me out of my shell, not by force, but by a genuine interest in the world as I saw it. He never made me feel like my quietness was a flaw to be fixed. In turn, I think I offered him a place where he didn't have to be Julian the swimmer, the ever-confident, ever-smiling leader. With me, he could be tired. He could be uncertain. He could be quiet. The moment my feelings for him tipped over the edge from friendship into something deeper, something more perilous, is etched into my memory with the precision of a master photograph. It was the end of our junior year. He had just lost the final, championship-defining race by a fraction of a second. The crushing weight of the team's disappointment was his to bear alone. I found him hours later, not with his teammates, but by the river that cut through the edge of campus. He was skipping stones across the water, his form perfect even in this small, idle act. He didn't turn when I approached, as if he'd known I would find him. We stood in silence for a long time, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. He finally spoke, his voice rough. "I let them down." It wasn't a plea for reassurance. It was a flat statement of fact. I didn't offer platitudes. I didn't tell him it was okay. I just stood beside him, a silent witness to his pain. After a while, he stopped throwing stones and just stared at the water. I saw a single tear trace a path through the grime on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. In that moment, watching this strong, beautiful man break in the quietest, most private way, my heart did something I had never allowed it to do. It broke with his. But it was more than just empathy. It was a profound, seismic shift inside me. A feeling so fierce and tender it stole my breath. It was the calamitous, undeniable realization that I was in love with my best friend. The knowledge landed not with a soft flutter, but with the terrifying weight of a stone dropping into a deep well, the ripples spreading out to touch every corner of my being. I knew, in that same instant, that I could never tell him. Our friendship was a rare and precious thing, a sanctuary. To confess my feelings would be to risk its destruction. It would be like taking a hammer to a delicate piece of glass. So I made a choice. I took that feeling, that vast and overwhelming love, and I built a room for it inside my heart. I furnished it with all the little moments, the way he laughed, the intensity in his eyes when he talked about code, the easy way he slung his arm over my shoulder. And then I locked the door and threw away the key. I became the custodian of my own secret, living in a house with a room I could never enter, but whose presence I felt every single day. I learned to live with the low, constant ache of it. I watched him date a string of bright, bubbly women, a Sarah, a Jessica, a Lauren. They were nice enough, but I always saw the same pattern. They were drawn to the Julian everyone saw, the confident, charming athlete. They never seemed to have the patience for the quiet, contemplative man I knew. Their relationships would burn bright and fast, then fizzle out, and each time, he would come to me, confused and a little more guarded, and I would be the good friend, the stable ground beneath his feet, all while the locked room inside me groaned at the hinges. His longest relationship was with Clara. She was an architect, sharp and ambitious, and for a while, I thought she might be different. She seemed to appreciate his intellect, his drive. They were a power couple, their lives a whirlwind of professional networking and weekend trips I was never invited on. I saw less of him during those 2 years. Our friendship was relegated to occasional texts and rushed coffee meetings where he seemed distracted, his mind on a deadline or a dinner plan with her. I missed him with a physical ache, the kind you get when a phantom limb itches. I told myself it was for the best. He was building a life, a proper one, and my role was to be a part of its history, not its future. The door to the secret room in my heart felt sealed with rust, the silence within it deafening. I focused on my photography, pouring all my unspent longing into my work. I captured images of lonely landscapes, of empty rooms filled with afternoon light, of objects left behind. My portfolio became an unwitting monument to my own quiet heartbreak, and it was, ironically, the best work I had ever done. I was learning to build a life around the empty space he had left behind. Then came the shift, the catalyst that would send a tremor through all our carefully constructed realities. It was a Thursday night in late October. A cold rain was lashing against the windows of my small apartment, the kind of weather that feels like the sky is trying to wash the world clean. I was in my makeshift darkroom, a converted walk-in closet, watching an image of a lone, skeletal tree emerge in the developing tray. There was a strange poetry to it, the way the picture slowly resolved from the chemical murk, a memory being coaxed into existence. My phone buzzed on a shelf, the vibration a jarring intrusion into the quiet, sacred space. I almost ignored it. It was after 11, but a premonition, a cold prickle on my skin, made me reach for it. The screen glowed with Julian's name. My heart gave a painful lurch. He hadn't called me this late in years. Leo. His voice was a wreck. It was thin and frayed, stripped of all its usual warmth and confidence. It sounded like a transmission from a great distance, distorted by static and grief. Julian? What's wrong? Where are you? I was already pulling off my rubber gloves, my mind racing through a Rolodex of potential disasters. A car accident. A family emergency. Can I come over? He asked, and the question was so small, so fragile, it almost didn't survive the journey through the phone. There was a long pause, filled with the sound of his unsteady breathing. I don't want to be at my place. And I can't. I don't have anywhere else to go. That last part landed like a punch to the gut. I don't have anywhere else to go. In 2 years with Clara, in the life they had built, he had somehow ended up with nowhere to go. Of course, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Don't even ask. Just come. 20 minutes later, he was at my door. He didn't look like the Julian I knew, or even the memory of the Julian I kept locked away. He looked like a stranger who had been hollowed out from the inside. His clothes were rumpled, his face was pale and drawn, and his eyes, those bright, intelligent eyes, were vacant, staring at a point somewhere over my shoulder. He was soaked from the rain, which dripped from the ends of his hair onto my wooden floor, forming a small, dark puddle at his feet. He didn't have a bag, not even a jacket. He had just walked out into the storm. He stepped inside without a word, and I closed the door, shutting out the wailing of the wind. The silence in the hallway was heavier than any sound. He stood there, dripping and lost, and my first instinct was to wrap my arms around him, to pull him close and hold him until the shaking stopped. But I couldn't. That was a line I had never crossed, a boundary as clear and unforgiving as a line of cliffs. To do so now, in his moment of supreme vulnerability, would have felt like a transgression, a selfish act of taking advantage of his pain. So I stood there, my hands clenched into useless fists at my sides, my heart a chaotic symphony of pity and a terrible, rising hope I was ashamed to even acknowledge. The locked room inside me was rattling, its prisoner sensing a crack in the foundations. "It's over," he said, his voice a raw whisper that barely disturbed the air. "Clara and me. It's over." He didn't offer details, and I didn't ask for them. The how and why didn't matter in that moment. All that mattered was the aftermath, the wreckage of a man standing in my entryway. I led him to the sofa and handed him a towel. He dried his hair with slow, mechanical movements, his gaze still fixed on nothing. I made him tea, my hands moving on autopilot, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the churning sea of his distress. He took the mug, his fingers wrapping around it as if for warmth, but he didn't drink. He just sat there, holding it, a small, ceramic buoy in an ocean of grief. I sat in the armchair opposite him, keeping a careful distance. I was acutely aware of the space between us, a no-man's land fraught with unspoken things. This was different from the time he'd lost the swim meet. That had been disappointment, a failure he could eventually recover from. This was a deeper wound. This was the dismantling of a life he had tried to build. I watched him, and the photographer in me saw the composition of the scene, the harsh overhead light casting deep shadows under his eyes, the slumped posture of defeat, the untouched mug of tea growing cold. But the man in me, the friend, the secret lover, saw only his pain. And beneath that, a dangerous thought began to form. It was a selfish, monstrous thought, and I hated myself for it. He's here, with me. He finally spoke again, his voice still a ghost of itself. "Can I just stay here tonight? On the couch. I can't go back there. Her things are everywhere. My things are everywhere. It doesn't feel like my home anymore. You can stay as long as you need," I said, and the words felt both profoundly true and incredibly dangerous. I was opening a door, not just to my apartment, but to a different kind of space in our relationship. He was no longer a visitor. He was a refugee, and I was his sanctuary. As I went to get him blankets and a pillow from the linen closet, I felt that tectonic shift again. He had come to me not for a laugh or a distraction, but for shelter. He was asking to be let into a room in our friendship that had previously been locked, a quiet, private space away from the world. And as I spread the blankets on the sofa, a part of me, the part one tried so hard to silence, whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was also knocking, however unconsciously, on that other locked door. The one deep inside of me. The thought was terrifying, and it was the only thing that kept me from falling apart myself. That first night set the pattern for what was to come. It was the beginning of the ritual. He slept on my couch, a restless, fitful sleep punctuated by sighs that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night. I lay awake in my own bed, in the next room, listening to the sound of his troubled breathing, feeling like a sentry on watch. The apartment, which had always been my solitary haven, now held a second heartbeat, a second presence that reconfigured its entire emotional geography. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, the blankets folded neatly on the sofa, the mug washed and placed in the drying rack. There was no note. For a few frantic hours, I thought that was it, a one-time crisis, a brief port in a storm before he sailed on. I felt a confusing mix of relief and profound disappointment. But he came back that evening. He brought a takeout bag of Thai food, our old favorite, and an apology in his eyes. He didn't say he was sorry for his state the night before, but for his abrupt departure. I had to go to work, he said, as if that explained everything. We ate in a comfortable silence, the kind we had perfected over years of friendship. He talked a little about his day, a frustrating bug in a piece of software he was developing, his words clinical and detached. He didn't mention Clara. He didn't mention the gaping hole that had been torn in his life. It was as if he had built a wall around the wound, and he was inviting me to exist on the safe side of it with him. And I, desperate to keep him there, willingly agreed to the unspoken terms. We would not speak of the ruin. We would simply live in the quiet space that came after. That night, he stayed again. And the next, the guest room in my apartment, which had been a storage space for my surplus camera equipment and stacks of art books, was technically available. I offered it to him, gesturing towards the closed door. You know, you don't have to sleep on the couch. There's a proper bed in there. He just shook his head, a flicker of something I couldn't decipher in his eyes. No, the couch is fine. It's closer to what? I wanted to ask. To the kitchen? To the bathroom? To me? The question hung in the air, unasked and unanswered. So the couch became his space. Within a week, it was no longer a temporary arrangement. A duffel bag appeared, tucked neatly into a corner. A toothbrush joined mine in the holder in the bathroom. His expensive, citrus-scented shampoo sat next to my generic brand in the shower, its fragrance a subtle, constant reminder of his presence. My apartment was slowly, inexorably becoming our apartment. The ritual of the movie nights began organically. After the first week of stilted silences and him retreating into himself, I suggested we watch a movie one night, an attempt to fill the quiet with something other than his palpable grief. I put on an old, cheesy sci-fi film from our college days, something we could mock and enjoy without any emotional investment. It worked. I saw the first genuine smile I'd seen on his face in days. So we did it again the next night. It became our routine. We would eat dinner, clean up, and then settle on the couch, the blue light of the television washing over us. At first, there was a careful, deliberate space between us, a buffer zone of an inch or two on the worn cushions. But as the days bled into weeks, the geography of the couch began to change. The space between us began to shrink. It started with a simple, almost accidental touch. He was exhausted after a long day at work, the stress of his project compounding his emotional turmoil. Midway through the movie, his head drooped, and then, with a soft sigh, it came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending fired at once. I could feel the texture of his hair against my neck, the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. I held my breath, waiting for him to realize what he'd done and pull away, embarrassed. But he didn't. He just settled in, his breathing evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. I sat there for 2 hours, my arm going numb, my heart hammering against my ribs, a prisoner of this terrifying, wonderful intimacy. When the movie ended, I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat in the darkness, listening to him breathe, feeling the weight of him against me as the most profound burden and the most incredible gift. That night broke a seal. The shoulder became an accepted territory. A few nights later, he was particularly wrecked. He had spent the day dealing with lawyers, with the logistics of untangling a shared life. He didn't even pretend to watch the movie. He just curled up on his end of the couch, his body turned towards me. About an hour in, he shifted, and without a word, stretched out and laid his head in my lap. The world stopped. It was a gesture of such complete and utter trust, of such blatant need, that it transcended the boundaries of our carefully maintained friendship. My lap. It was a shockingly intimate place. My hand hovered in the air for a moment, uncertain of its role. Was I allowed to touch him? Was that part of this new, unspoken agreement? Trembling, I slowly lowered my hand and rested it on his hair. It was as soft as I had always imagined. He sighed, a sound of deep, bone-weary contentment, and melted into me. And so the ritual was cemented. This became our nightly sacrament. We would put on a movie, and he would lay his head in my lap, and I would rest my hand on his hair or his shoulder. We never spoke of it. Not the next morning, not ever. During the day, we were Leo and Julian, best friends navigating a difficult time. We'd make coffee, talk about work, run errands. But at night, in the dim light of the television, we transformed. We became something else, something nameless and fragile. I lived for those nights with a desperate, all-consuming hunger. The rest of my day became a prelude, a waiting period. I would go through the motions of my own life, my own work, but my entire being was oriented towards the evening, towards the moment he would finally let his guard down and seek comfort in my arms. I became a scholar of his smallest gestures. I learned the difference between his tired sighs and his sad sighs. I learned the way his shoulders would tense when a scene in a movie inadvertently reminded him of something he'd lost, and I would instinctively tighten my hand on his arm, a silent message of solidarity. I was living in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses tuned to the subtlest frequencies of his being. It was exhausting and exhilarating. I was an anthropologist studying a tribe of two, documenting a culture of unspoken things. The plausible deniability was our shield. He was grieving. He was exhausted. He didn't want to be alone. These were the reasons, the logical, acceptable explanations for why my straight best friend was sleeping in my lap every night. They were good reasons. They were true reasons. But I knew, with a certainty that was both a terror and a hope, that they were not the only reasons. I felt like I was developing a photograph in slow motion, over weeks and months. The image was faint, its subject unclear, but with each passing night, each accepted touch, it was slowly coming into focus. I could almost make out the shape of it, this new thing we were becoming. But I was terrified that any sudden movement, any demand for clarity, would be like flicking on the lights in the darkroom, overexposing the delicate image and ruining it forever. And so I waited. I waited in the beautiful, agonizing silence, my hand in his hair, his warmth a constant, grounding presence, and I prayed that I was reading the signs right. I prayed that the image emerging from the chemical bath was not just a product of my own desperate imagination, but something real, something shared. The door to his room remained ajar, an invitation I was still too afraid to accept, and the door to my own heart's secret chamber was beginning to splinter, its lock about to break from the pressure within. The crossing happened on a Sunday night. The day had been heavy and gray, a thick blanket of clouds smothering the city and making the world feel small and close. A persistent, gentle rain had started in the afternoon, tapping a soft, hypnotic rhythm against the window panes. It was the kind of weather that encourages introspection and stillness. Julian had been quiet all day, lost in thought. He'd spent a few hours on his laptop, finalizing the sale of the apartment he had once shared with Clara. It was the last major tie, the final logistical amputation. When he closed the laptop, he carried an air of finality, but not of relief. He just seemed empty. We ordered pizza, not having the energy to cook, and ate it straight from the box, sitting on the living room floor. The usual easy banter was absent, replaced by a comfortable, if melancholy, silence. Later, we transitioned to the couch, assuming our now familiar positions. I put on a nature documentary, something about the deep ocean, hoping the calm, alien world would be soothing. He settled himself, his head finding its customary place in my lap. I rested my hand on his shoulder, the gesture now as natural as breathing. The narrator's voice droned on about bioluminescent creatures in the abyssal plain, a world of perpetual darkness punctuated by strange, beautiful lights. It felt fitting. The rain continued its soft percussion against the glass. For a long time, I thought he was asleep. His breathing was deep and even, his body still. I watched the strange, ethereal jellyfish pulse across the screen, my mind drifting, lulled by the rain and the warmth of him. The weight of his head was a solid, grounding reality in the quiet room. Then, I felt his thumb trace a small, slow circle on my leg. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but it was deliberate. It was not the unconscious twitch of a sleeping man. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. The thumb continued its slow, lazy orbit on the worn fabric of my jeans. It was a question. It was a signal fire lit in the darkness. My heart, which had been beating in a slow, steady rhythm, began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. The narrator was talking about the immense pressure in the deep sea, how it could crush anything not built to withstand it. I felt that pressure in my own chest, a crushing, exhilarating weight. He shifted, not away, but further in, turning his face slightly so his cheek was pressed against my stomach. His hand moved from my leg and came to rest on my chest, his fingers splayed out directly over my frantic heart. He must have felt it, the wild, panic drumming. He must have known. Still, he didn't speak. The silence in the room stretched, becoming thin and electric. The only sounds were the rain, the distant voice from the television, and the blood roaring in my ears. This was it, the moment of truth. The tightrope I had been walking for months had led me here, to this precipice. Slowly, he pushed himself up. He didn't move far, just propped himself on one elbow, his body still intimately close to mine. He was no longer in my lap, but beside me, hovering over me. The blue light of the television illuminated his face, carving it out of the shadows. His eyes, when they met mine, were dark pools of something I couldn't name. It was fear. It was longing. It was the same terrifying vulnerability I had seen in that first, pivotal glance weeks ago, but now it was amplified, concentrated. The plausible deniability was gone. There was no pretense of sleep, no excuse of exhaustion. There was only this. Us, in the charged space between our faces. Leo, he whispered, and my name was a fragile thing in the quiet room. I couldn't form words. I could only look at him, my entire being focused into that single point of contact, our shared gaze. He swallowed, his throat working. Would it be okay, he began, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. He stopped, as if the words themselves were too heavy to lift. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again, a raw plea in their depths. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question was not a proposition. It was a confession. It was an act of surrender. It was the most terrifying and beautiful question I had ever heard. In that one sentence, he was laying his own confusion and fear bare, handing me the power to either save him or shatter him completely. And in that moment, I knew I had been wrong. I had thought I was the only one in danger, the only one risking his heart. But he had been on his own precipice all along, just as afraid as I was. 1,000 answers crowded my mind, a torrent of yes and fears and questions. But none of them came out. Instead, I just gave a small, shaky nod. It was barely a movement at all, but in the electric field between us, it felt like a seismic event. He leaned in slowly, giving me every possible chance to turn away, to stop him, to retreat to the safety of our old world. I didn't. I held his gaze, and as he drew closer, I closed my eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. His lips met mine with a feather-light touch. It was not a kiss of passion, not of fire and demand. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It was hesitant and soft, tentative and questioning. It tasted of salt from the pizza we'd eaten and the rain that clung to the air. It was a kiss that asked more than it answered. It was a silent conversation in a language we were both learning for the first time. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed together in the darkness, the documentary about the deep sea playing on, a forgotten witness to the moment our own dark, quiet world was finally, irrevocably illuminated. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of our friendship, nor was it the charged, anticipatory stillness of the previous weeks. It was a brittle, anxious silence, thin as ice on a winter pond. I woke up first, a habit ingrained from years of being a lighter sleeper. The first thing I was aware of was the empty space beside me on the couch. He wasn't there. For a disorienting moment, I thought I had dreamed the whole thing. The rain, the question, the impossible softness of his lips. But then I saw his pillow and blanket, crumpled and discarded, not folded neatly as they usually were. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I sat up, the apartment feeling unervingly large and empty. The door to the guest room, the one he never used, was closed. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed, staring into a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. He was leaning against the counter, his posture rigid, his shoulders tight. He didn't look at me when I entered. He just kept his gaze fixed on the dark surface of the coffee. The air between us was thick with unspoken recriminations and fear. The beautiful, fragile thing we had created in the dark had, it seemed, not survived the harsh light of day. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. "Hey," he mumbled back, still not looking at me. He took a nervous sip of his coffee. The easy intimacy of the night before, the feeling of his forehead pressed against mine, might as well have been a memory from another lifetime, belonging to two different people. This man in my kitchen was a stranger, guarded and distant, a million miles away. I have an early meeting," he said, pushing himself off the counter. The words were clipped, rehearsed. It was a flimsy excuse, and we both knew it. I should get going. He moved to rinse his mug in the sink, his movements jerky and efficient, every action designed to avoid facing me. The hurt that bloomed in my chest was sharp and immediate. It was a physical pain, a cruel inversion of the tenderness I had felt just hours before. I had been given a glimpse of something extraordinary, only to have it snatched away, leaving me more bereft than before. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful fool who had misinterpreted a moment of desperate, grief-stricken confusion for something real. He had been vulnerable, and I had let him cross a line, and now he was filled with regret. The shame of it was a bitter taste in my mouth. "Julian," I said, and my voice was stronger than I expected, laced with a cold anger born of hurt. "Don't." He froze, his back still to me. "Don't do this," I continued, stepping further into the kitchen. "Don't pretend it didn't happen. And don't insult my intelligence with a fake meeting." He slowly turned to face me. The look on his face was not one of anger or annoyance. It was one of pure, panicked fear. He looked like a cornered animal. "Leo, I can't," he stammered, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure distress. It was a mistake." The word mistake landed in the space between us and shattered everything. The months of quiet intimacy, the shared vulnerability, the soft, questioning kiss, all of it reduced to a mistake. The anger in my chest curdled into a deep, hollow ache. I had been so careful. I had guarded his heart, and my own, with such painstaking patience. And for what? To be dismissed as a moment of poor judgment. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "Was it a mistake every night for the past 2 months when you fell asleep in my lap? Was it a mistake when you told me you had nowhere else to go? Or was it just the kiss? Is that the only part you're trying to erase?" My words hit their mark. He flinched as if I had physically struck him. "It's not like that," he said, his voice pleading. I'm confused. I don't know what I'm doing. My life is a mess, Leo. I just blew up a 2-year relationship. I don't know who I am right now. And last night," he trailed off, unable to finish. "Last night you were honest." I finished for him, the bitterness rising. "For maybe the first time. You asked for something, and I gave it to you. And now you're running away because you're scared of what it means." I took a step closer, my own fear now eclipsed by a desperate need for the truth, no matter how painful. "I deserve more than this, Julian. I deserve more than you sneaking out like a guilty teenager. If it was a mistake, then look me in the eye and tell me it meant nothing. But don't you dare disappear. Don't you dare turn our friendship into another piece of wreckage you leave behind." The confrontation hung in the air, my ultimatum laid bare. The silence that followed was excruciating. He stood there, wrestling with himself, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. I could see the fear, the confusion, the shame. But underneath it all, I saw something else, something I clung to, a profound sadness. He wasn't running from me because he felt nothing. He was running because he felt too much. Finally, he broke. His shoulders slumped in defeat, and he covered his face with his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice muffled. "God, Leo, I'm so sorry. I'm not running from you. I'm running from me." He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've spent my whole life on a set path. College, swim team, good job, girlfriend, future. It was all laid out. And then it all fell apart. And in the middle of all that chaos, the only thing that felt real, the only place I felt safe, was here, with you." He took a shaky breath. I didn't understand it. I kept telling myself it was just friendship, that I was just leaning on you. But last night, when I asked you that, I knew it was more. And it terrified me. Because this feeling, this thing with you, it feels more real than anything I had with Clara. More real than anything I've ever felt. And I don't know what to do with it. I'm a guy who dates women. That's who I am. Or, that's who I thought I was. And now, he gestured helplessly between us. I kissed my best friend, and the only thing that felt like a mistake was the thought of stopping. His confession, raw and fractured, undid me. The anger drained away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was grappling with the foundations of his own identity. He was just as lost as I had been for years. Only his crisis was compressed into a few frantic, terrifying weeks. I closed the distance between us, and, this time, I didn't hesitate. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into a hug that was years overdue. He stiffened for a second, surprised, and then he collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. I held him tightly, my own tears finally falling, mingling with his. We stood there in my sunlit kitchen, two broken people holding each other together, the wreckage of our old world scattered around us, finally speaking the truth. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, we began to build something new. The days that followed his confession were not marked by a sudden, cinematic romance. There were no grand gestures or passionate declarations. Instead, our new beginning was quiet, tentative, and achingly gentle. It was built not on the rubble of what we had been, but on the new, solid ground of honesty. We talked. For the first time, we truly talked. We sat on the couch, not with a movie as a buffer, but facing each other, the space between us filled with careful words instead of unspoken longing. He told me about the slow erosion of his relationship with Clara, the feeling of performing a role he no longer believed in. He spoke of his loneliness, a profound and pervasive ache that even being in a long-term relationship had never managed to soothe. He confessed that his feelings for me had been a quiet, confusing undercurrent in his life for years, a magnetic pull he had consciously fought against, channeling it into the safe, acceptable container of best friendship. I listened, and I shared my own story. I told him about that day by the river, the moment my heart had irrevocably broken for him and reformed into something new. I confessed the years of silent pining, the careful preservation of our friendship at the expense of my own feelings. I described the locked room inside me, the secret I had guarded for so long. As I spoke, I felt a profound sense of release, as if I were finally unlocking that door and letting the stale, lonely air rush out, replaced by the fresh, clean air of shared truth. He listened to me with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I never had before. When I finished, there were tears in his eyes. "You loved me all this time?" he asked, his voice thick with wonder and regret. "And I never knew. I didn't want you to know," I admitted. "I was too afraid of losing you." "You could never lose me," he said, and the simple certainty in his voice was the most reassuring sound I had ever heard. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. It wasn't a hesitant touch, not anymore. It was a deliberate, confident connection, a statement. We were no longer just friends. We were this, whatever this was. Our routines shifted in small, significant ways. The movie nights continued, but their purpose changed. They were no longer a pretext for closeness. Now, when he laid his head in my lap, it was an open, unambiguous act of affection. My hand in his hair was not a tentative exploration, but a familiar comfort, a language we were both now fluent in. Sometimes, halfway through a film, he would turn and kiss me, softly and without ceremony, a simple punctuation mark in the quiet sentence of our evening. The anxiety that had once crackled in the air was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. The constant internal monologue of analysis and fear in my head finally fell silent. I no longer had to interpret his every breath, his every sigh. I could just be with him. I could just enjoy the solid, comforting weight of him, the simple, miraculous fact of his presence. The guest room door, which had stood for so long as a symbol of our ambiguous state, the open invitation, the uncrossed threshold, was now firmly closed every night. Not because he was inside it, but because he had no use for it anymore. A few nights after our talk, as we were getting ready for bed, he had simply followed me into my room, a silent question in his eyes. I had pulled back the covers on my side of the bed, a silent answer. He had slid in beside me, and as I turned off the light, he had wrapped his arm around my waist and pulled me close, his chin resting on my shoulder. Lying there in the dark, his steady breath warming the back of my neck, his heartbeat a slow, strong rhythm against my back, I felt a sense of homecoming so profound it almost made me weep. For years, my bed had been a lonely island. Now, it was a harbor. Our life together took on the quiet rhythm of domesticity. We learned the small details of sharing a space, a life. I learned that he hummed, slightly off-key, when he was coding. He learned that I needed absolute quiet and a very specific kind of light to edit my photographs. He started making the coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it, while I would often have dinner ready for him when he came home from work. My small apartment, once a fortress of solitude, softened at the edges. It became a home, filled with the sounds of two people living. The click of his keyboard, the soft shutter of my camera, the easy laughter that now came more freely than ever before. My photography changed, too. The lonely landscapes and empty rooms in my portfolio began to be replaced. I started taking pictures of him. Not posed portraits, but candid moments. Julian, asleep in a patch of morning sun on the couch, his hands, strong and capable, chopping vegetables for dinner, his silhouette in the doorway, a look of soft contentment on his face as he watched me work. My art had always been about capturing what was missing. Now, it was about celebrating what was found. One Saturday afternoon, months later, we were sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by stacks of my old photographs. I was organizing my archives, a task I usually did alone. But he had insisted on helping, looking at each image with a genuine, quiet interest. He picked up the photo from college, the one that had started it all, the image of him, exhausted and vulnerable, on the edge of the pool. He held it for a long time, a faint smile on his lips. "This is where it started, isn't it?" he said softly. "You saw me, before anyone else did. Before I even really saw myself." He looked up from the photograph, his eyes meeting mine, and in them, I saw none of the fear or confusion that had haunted him before. I saw only love, clear and deep and certain. In that moment, I thought about the nature of change. We think of it as a sudden event, a storm that arrives without warning. But sometimes, it is a much slower process. It is the patient work of water on stone, the gradual turning of the seasons, the slow development of a photograph in a dark room. Our love hadn't been a lightning strike. It had been a tide, slowly, imperceptibly rising for years until it finally, gently, washed away the shore we had been standing on, leaving us together in a new and beautiful sea. We had navigated the wreckage. We had spoken the truths we were so afraid of, and we had found our way not to a frantic, passionate romance, but to something far more precious, a quiet, steady, and unconditional peace. We began to heal, not just from our individual heartbreaks, but from the long, lonely years of hiding. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create together.